In 2010's World Wake, we saw 4 creature types grouped together for the first time on Quest for Ula's Temple. A card that, after you complete the quest, lets you put a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent directly on the battlefield. Together, these creatures are often called sea monsters. Since 2010, we've seen these creature types used together periodically, and just recently, all creatures with the Cephalid creature type were errated to Octopus. This is in line with what they've done recently with Viashinos and Nagas, which were changed to lizards and snakes respectively. Cephalids are still a thing within the lore, but because a cephalid is a humanoid octopus, they decided to simplify things. In other words, cephalid is to octopus what loxodon is to elephant, and now we have a lot more octopuses, which in turn means we have a lot more sea monster creatures. I've also never looked at any of these 4 creature types individually, and as a result of all that, I thought it would be a good time to look at these 4 sea monster creature types in an MTG top 10, and I've got to say, putting all 4 of these creature types together resulted in a pretty stacked list, although as we'll see, there is one creature type of the 4 that was left off the list entirely. If you think you can guess which one, post in the comments before you watch the rest of the video. In all, there are 161 cards with one of these 4 types, or that make creature tokens of one of these 4 types, and in this video we'll look at the 10 sea monsters that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Laan Cephalid Empress. That's right, we're starting things off with a newly minted Octopus. For 3 generic and a blue, she's a 2/3, and when she enters the battlefield, you return all blue creatures your opponent controls to their owner's hands, and your opponents can't cast blue spells. That's right, she's blue herself, but she's great at hating on opposing blue creatures. The bounce itself is already pretty sweet, but stopping your opponent from ever casting those cards is even sweeter. Upon being printed, she saw some sideboard play in both block and extended. In extended, she was one of the best ways to deal with Morphling, so she was worth bringing in against control decks. But she stopped seeing play for a pretty long time after that, until 2010, when Merfolk decks emerged as a very real force in Legacy. Most Merfolk decks are low on removal, so if you play Laan against them, it's pretty much game over. Even True Name Nemesis gets bounced by Laan. One of the sweeter decks for Laan is the Painter combo deck, which would make it so Laan could just bounce all of your opponent's stuff, and they would never be able to cast it, even if it normally wouldn't be blue. Laan hasn't seen significant play in Legacy since 2018 though, and she may not be on this list much longer. Gearseeker Serpent is only 2 points behind her. At number 9, it's Striped River Winder. For 6 generic and a blue, it's a 5/5 Serpent with hexproof. That's a horrible rate, so it's a good thing you can also cycle it for 1 blue mana. That means you can pay the cost and discard it to draw a card. While adding modality to a card like this is nice, since you can just replace it if you get it early, even that alone wouldn't be enough for a card this expensive to be worth playing. However, there is one modern deck where this kind of card is right at home, Living End. This deck is entirely made up of Living End, creatures with cycling with high mana values, and cards with Cascade. The plan is to cycle away your Striped River Winders and the like until you have a loaded graveyard, and then you find one of the Cascade cards and you cast it, and you hit Living End 100% of the time, reanimate all your cycled big creatures, and blow up your opponent's board. While the deck is a little less dominant as a result of the banning of Violent Outburst, it's still a very real deck in Modern, and it's likely to continue to gain points in the format. At number 8, it's Blade Coil Serpent. It's a little weird that this has one of those sea monster creature types because this serpent doesn't exactly look like it spends much time in the water. Anyway, for X and 6 generic, it's a 5/4 artifact creature, and it gives you an enter the battlefield ability based on the mana you spend to cast it. The X in the cost is only there so that you can sink as much mana into it as you have. For every blue you pay, you get to draw a card. For every black your opponent discards a card, and for every red it gets +1/+0 haste and trample until end of turn. If you have the right kind of mana, the Serpent can be completely insane. Even if you just get one trigger of each of these, we're talking about a 6 mana 6/5 with trample and haste that draws you a card and makes your opponent discard a card. You can also go all in on one of the enter the battlefield abilities if you have the right mana. The Serpent has seen lots of play in Grixis and Rakdos control decks in Standard, especially in 2022 and 2023. So far in 2024 it's only got 1 point, but it does have plenty of time left in Standard, and it's likely to add to its score. At number 7, it's Seid Illusionist. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/1, and whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability, you put the top 3 cards of your library into the graveyard. You can also pay 2 generic and a blue and tap it to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target creature you control, but it's that first part that has led to the Illusionist seeing so much play. If you can find a way to target for free repeatedly, you can just dump your whole library into your graveyard and as early as turn 2. These decks, often called Cephalid Breakfast, first found success in Extended, where you could play a turn 1 Nomads and Core, a turn 2 Illusionist, and use the Nomad's ability to target the Illusionist as many times as you wanted. While the ability redirects damage, you can choose to target the Illusionist with it at any time, not only when damage is happening. If you had 2 creatures in play, you could also just move Shuko back and forth between your creatures to mill your whole graveyard as well. Once you mill your whole library, you can reanimate a huge sutured ghoul with a dragon breath attached to it and end the game on the spot. After that brief success in Extended, the combo also transitioned to Legacy, but then went dormant for a very long time until 2019 when Cephalid Breakfast was born again thanks to Thassa's Oracle, which gives you the greatest reward possible for milling your entire library. You win the game. Right now, Cephalid Breakfast decks are still racking up top finishes in Legacy, and they even got an interesting new tool in Nadu Winged Wisdom, who also likes to be targeted, so the Illusionist is likely to move even higher on this list. At number 6, it's Obscura Interceptor. New Capenna was the first set in a long time with Cephalids. They have a completely different design than earlier ones though, and don't look like they spend that much time in the water, so it's a little awkward that they have one of the sea monster creature types now. But anyway, the Interceptor is 1 generic, a white, a blue, and a black for a 3/1 with flash and lifelink, and whenever it enters the battlefield, it connives, which means you draw a card and discard a card, and if you discard a non-land, the Interceptor gets a +1/+1 counter, and when it connives, you can also return target spell to its owner's hand. Interacting with spells on the stack isn't an effect we see all that often, and when we do, it tends to be pretty powerful. In this case, you add a very real body to the board while getting some card selection too, and if the spell is expensive enough, you almost feel like you're casting Time Walk. The Interceptor can even ambush block something and gain you life at the same time. It has gained all of its points in a deck that's been doing well in Standard for a couple of years now, Esper Raffine. This deck features several creatures that connive and is well equipped to take advantage of discarding stuff for value, like with Denic Pious Apprentice. The Interceptor only has a couple of months left in Standard and hasn't put up top finishes in any other format yet, so it may not add much to its score in the future. At number 5, it's Tarian Terror. For 6 generic and a blue, it's a 5/5 that costs 1 generic less to cast for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and it has Ward too. So, if you can load your graveyard with cheap spells in the early game, you can slam this on the board on turn 2 or 3, and between its size and Ward, your opponent is going to have a hard time taking it down quickly. The Terror has seen play in spell decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Pauper, and that's likely to continue in Standard and Pauper at least. At number 4, it's Coma Cosmos Serpent. For 3 generic, 2 green, and 2 blue, it's a 6/6 that can't be countered. It spits out a 3/3 blue Serpent token every upkeep, and you can sacrifice a Serpent to tap a permanent and shut off its activated abilities for the turn, or you can give Coma indestructibility. Obviously, Coma is a super pushed Serpent. Because he gives you a token each upkeep, you're usually going to have one by the time your opponent can do anything about Coma, at which point you can make him indestructible if you need to. And if you don't have to, you're quickly going to populate the board with 3/3s. Since being printed, it's seen regular play in Standard, where it's been a win condition in control decks, and it's also been great in Luca decks, which can use his -2 to cheat it into play. It's also used in Pioneer Fires of Invention decks, where it's currently gaining points. These decks don't have to worry about Coma's intensive mana cost if they have fires in play. At number 3, it's Hullbreaker Horror. So far, this list has been all Serpents and Octopuses, but this is a Kraken. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 7/8 with flash that can't be countered. Whenever you cast a spell, you can choose up to 1. You can return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or you can return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This massive creature can flash in and ambush block just about anything, and then anytime you cast a spell, you get a big effect. Whether you're bouncing stuff off the board or stuff off the stack, you're going to feel great about your situation. Basically, it's a huge creature that can function as a win condition while allowing you to interact in a big way no matter what kind of spells you're casting. The Hullbreaker is so powerful that it's seen play in every sanctioned 60-card format. Standard and Pioneer are definitely the 2 formats where it's been at its best. It's been a control deck win condition in both, and it's right at home in that style of deck. Because it has flash, you can pass your turn with all your mana up for your other interactive spells, and then slam this bad boy on the board at the end of your opponent's turn. Then you can untap with all your mana available again, and at that point the game is pretty much over. In Legacy, it's seen some play in artifact decks that run a bunch of fast mana and Pyxis of Pandemonium. It can use all that mana or the Pyxis to get the Horror into play, and then cast a bunch of cheaper free spells to bounce the opponent's board. And in Vintage, it's sometimes played in Oath of Druids decks. These decks can get the Horror into play on turn 2 sometimes, and if you're doing that, your opponent is never going to be able to make anything stick on the board. It actually works pretty well with Oath too, because your opponent can also get creatures out of it, but you can just keep bouncing whatever they get. The Horror is likely to keep gaining points, but that's true of the 2 cards in front of it too, so maybe number 3 is the best it can ever do on the list. At number 2, it's Thing in the Ice, another Kraken. For 1 generic and a blue, it starts out as a 0/4 Horror that enters with 4 ice counters, and anytime you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you remove an ice counter, and when it runs out of ice counters, it transforms into a Woken Horror, a Kraken Horror that bounces all non-horrors to the owner's hand when it transforms. So, like Hullbreaker Horror, it bounces a bunch of stuff and it's a 7/8, but it does it all at once. In fact, the identical stat line, type line, and similar effects, combined with the fact that the 2 cards have the same artist, and the fact that they are both on the plane of Innistrad, probably means this is the same Kraken. In other words, Hullbreaker Horror started out as Thing in the Ice. Anyway, in the right deck, transforming Thing in the Ice can be pretty easy, you just need some cheap spells. In Standard, Thing in the Ice was primarily played in Izzet control decks, but it didn't find a ton of success in the format. Thing in the Ice has seen play in Modern pretty much from the day it was printed though, appearing in various decks with other powerful spell payoffs like Young Pyromancer. It's also played in Arclight Phoenix decks in both Modern and Pioneer, and it's even seen some play in Vintage. It's likely to keep adding to its score, especially in Pioneer and Modern, but the number 1 card is also heavily played and in more formats right now, and that card is Yuon Sky Nomad. This is another creature where the sea monster typing is a little weird, since Yuon clearly spends its time in the sky. I guess maybe we can have the headcanon that it also spends a lot of time in the water despite its name and art. Anyway, for 3 generic and 2 blue-white hybrid mana, it's a 4/5 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile any number of other non-land permanents you control, and return them to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Yuon is of course also a companion. This means if you meet a special deck building requirement, you can have access to Yuon in your sideboard during the game. In this case, your deck has to have 20 more cards than the minimum deck size. That's a pretty low cost, especially in formats with huge card pools, especially because Yuon is a powerful card in its own right. It can represent a scary aerial threat while also generating tons of value with the mass blink effect. Originally, the companion rule was completely busted. You could simply cast your companion from your sideboard. In other words, it was like you started the game with an 8-card hand and that 8th card was one of the best cards in your deck. Now, luckily, you have to pay 3 generic to put a companion from your sideboard into your hand before you can ever cast it. Even with the rule nerfed, Yuon is insanely strong and has been heavily used as a companion in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. In fact, it was so good in Modern that it got banned out of the format. Of course, the fact that Yuon decks made up a huge percentage of the metagame and the larger decks were slowing down tournaments significantly also played a role in it getting banned. Even being banned in Modern, Yuon is still putting up a ton of points in Pioneer and Legacy, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So, those are Magic's best sea monsters. If you're looking to build a sea monster deck now that the pool of sea monsters has drastically increased thanks to the addition of Cephalids, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific creature types or groups of creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.